There are moments in history where crime, fame, and power collide so quietly that most people never realize how close things came to turning deadly. At the height of Muhammad Ali's rise, when the world saw a champion, the underworld saw opportunity, not applause, not legacy, money, influence, control. Boxing had long been tangled with organized crime, and Ali's meteoric rise made him impossible to ignore. Every fight moved massive money. Every decision carried weight far beyond the ring. And then there was Harlem, a place where territory mattered, where power was understood without being announced, and where one man's word carried enough force to stop problems before they started. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't Ali's manager, he wasn't his promoter, and he wasn't part of the boxing business, but he was something just as important, an authority the mafia respected. When whispers began to circulate about interest from the Genovese crime family, the question wasn't whether they had the reach, it was whether anyone would challenge them. Bumpy did. Not with gunfire, not with threats made in public, but with a quiet boundary drawn where Harlem ended and interference stopped. No headlines followed, no arrests, no violence, just a clear understanding that Muhammad Ali was off limits. This isn't a story about punches thrown in the ring. It's about power exercised in silence, alliances understood without paperwork, and a moment when the most famous boxer on earth was protected by a man history remembers as a gangster, but power knew as something else entirely. This is the moment crime and legacy nearly collided, and why they didn't. By the early 1960s, Muhammad Ali, then still known to the world as Cassius Clay, was no longer just a talented boxer. He was becoming a global phenomenon. Every fight drew enormous crowds, massive media attention, and just as importantly, huge betting activity. Some of that money was clean, much of it wasn't. Boxing, for decades, had been quietly influenced by organized crime, from promoters and managers to bookmakers and gambling networks that operated in the shadows. Ali's rise made him impossible to ignore. He was outspoken, unpredictable, and wildly popular. That combination made him valuable, and in the world of organized crime, value attracts attention. Control over a fighter like Ali didn't have to mean fixing fights. Sometimes it was about access, sometimes it was about leverage, and sometimes it was simply about ensuring nothing happened without permission. At the same time, in Harlem, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was firmly in control. Bumpy wasn't just another street figure, he was a strategist. He maintained working relationships with Italian mafia families, including the Genovese, but those relationships were built on mutual benefit and clearly defined boundaries. Harlem was Bumpy's territory, and he guarded its independence carefully. Anyone who operated there understood the rules, whether they were bookmakers, politicians, or outsiders with money and ambition. What made Bumpy different was restraint. He didn't rely on constant violence to enforce his authority. Instead, he relied on reputation, discipline, and the certainty that consequences existed even if they were never publicly displayed. That approach earned him a level of respect that few men outside the Italian mafia ever achieved. The Genovese crime family, meanwhile, was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. Their influence extended deep into labor unions, gambling, and professional sports. Boxing was especially important to them. It generated fast cash, global attention, and endless opportunities for quiet influence. A fighter like Ali represented everything they valued: high stakes, massive visibility, and long-term earning potential. But Ali was also different. He wasn't easily controlled. He spoke his mind, he challenged authority, and he spent time in Harlem surrounding himself with activists, artists, and leaders who existed outside the mafia's traditional sphere of influence. That put him directly under Bumpy Johnson's watch. As Ali's fame grew, so did the whispers. Not public threats, not open confrontations, just quiet conversations behind closed doors, questions about who had access, who offered protection, who set the limits. And that's where Bumpy stepped in. There was no dramatic showdown between Bumpy Johnson and the Genovese family, no public warning, no violent display. Instead, there was an understanding. Harlem was not the place to exert pressure on Muhammad Ali. Any attempt to manipulate, intimidate, or exploit him there would be viewed as crossing a line. The result was telling. Nothing happened. Ali continued his rise. The Mafia did not push forward, and Harlem remained calm. In the world of organized crime, silence often means agreement, and in this case, it suggests that Bumpy Johnson's influence was strong enough to protect one of the most famous men in the world without ever having to say a word publicly. Early in the 1960s, as Ali's profile continued to rise, the betting world took notice in a serious way. His fights weren't just sporting events anymore, they were financial events. Mafia-connected bookmakers who had long treated boxing as a reliable source of income reportedly tracked his bouts closely, not because they distrusted his talent, but because unpredictability creates risk. Ali was fast, outspoken, and impossible to intimidate in the traditional ways. For organized crime, that made him both valuable and dangerous. After Ali captured the heavyweight title, the attention intensified. Fighters at that level didn't move without pressure from multiple sides: managers, promoters, gambling interests, and political figures. Rumors began circulating that certain crime figures wanted influence over Ali's career. Influence didn't necessarily mean controlling the outcome of fights. Often it meant access, shaping opponents, steering venues, managing financial streams, or positioning trusted intermediaries close to the fighter. None of this required threats. Influence in organized crime is often quiet, contractual, and difficult to trace. But Ali wasn't operating in isolation. He spent increasing amounts of time in Harlem, a neighborhood that was more than a cultural center, it was a power center. There, Ali connected with civil rights leaders, activists, and thinkers who shaped his evolving worldview. Harlem gave him a sense of identity beyond boxing, and it placed him firmly within Bumpy Johnson's territory. Bumpy understood exactly what Ali represented. Not just a champion, but a symbol. A young black athlete with global attention, political awareness, and growing influence. That combination could bring opportunity or danger to Harlem, and Bumpy had spent decades ensuring that outside forces didn't destabilize his community. According to multiple accounts from journalists and historians, this is when Bumpy made his position clear. Not through threats, not through public statements, but through quiet communication within the criminal ecosystem. The message was simple. Muhammad Ali was not to be touched, pressured, or manipulated while under Harlem's watch. That message mattered because it came from someone the Mafia respected. Bumpy wasn't reckless. He honored agreements. He maintained order, and he understood the cost of conflict with the Italian families. His word carried weight because it was rarely given lightly. What followed is perhaps the strongest evidence of all. There was no public confrontation between Bumpy Johnson and the Genovese family. No violent retaliation, no sudden arrests, no exposed scandal. Ali's career continued forward without interference linked to Harlem. The Mafia did not press the issue there. In the world of organized crime, that kind of restraint isn't accidental. It suggests boundaries were acknowledged and respected. Silence, in this context, wasn't absence, it was confirmation. This wasn't about who was stronger, it was about balance, about knowing when pushing forward would cost more than stepping back. Ali remained free to fight, speak, and rise on his own terms. Harlem stayed stable, and Bumpy reinforced a reputation that had taken decades to build. a man who could protect his territory and the people within it without firing a single shot. That quiet moment, overlooked by most history books, reveals how power truly operated behind the scenes during one of boxing's most legendary eras. There is no court document proving a direct mafia threat against Muhammad Ali, but several indicators stand out, and together they form a pattern that's hard to ignore. First, boxing's documented ties to organized crime during this era are not speculation. Congressional hearings, journalistic investigations, and later FBI files all confirmed that the mafia had deep involvement in boxing for decades. Promoters, managers, rankings, and betting operations were frequently influenced behind the scenes. Fighters at Ali's level rarely escaped that ecosystem untouched. The absence of pressure is unusual, and that makes it meaningful. Second, Ali's unique protection in Harlem stands out. Harlem was not neutral ground. It was controlled territory, governed by rules enforced quietly but effectively. Ali wasn't just passing through. He was welcomed, visible, and socially active there. For a figure of his stature to move freely without intimidation or interference suggests more than coincidence. It suggests protection, understood by those who needed to understand it. Third, there's the absence of interference while Ali was under Bumpy Johnson's watch. No suspicious financial entanglements tied to Harlem, no sudden advisors, no pressure campaigns, no backroom maneuvers traced to that territory. In a business where control was often asserted early and aggressively, restraint becomes the anomaly worth studying. And then there's the testimonies. Journalists who covered both boxing and organized crime during the mid-20th century have repeatedly noted how unusual it was for someone like Ali to remain untouched in that environment. Historians point to Bumpy Johnson's unique position, a man who worked with the mafia but was not subordinate to them, especially when it came to Harlem's internal affairs. What's missing is just as telling as what exists. There are no police reports describing threats against Ali in Harlem, no court filings, no exposed wiretaps, no retaliatory violence. In a world where disputes often left visible scars, legal or physical, the lack of a paper trail suggests the issue was resolved before it ever escalated. From an analytical standpoint, this aligns with how high-level organized crime often operated. Not every conflict ends in bloodshed. Many end in conversation, in boundaries set quietly, in decisions made to avoid unnecessary risk. The smartest moves are the ones that never make headlines. If the Genovese family had pressed forward in Harlem, the cost could have outweighed the benefit. It risked destabilizing a profitable area, straining alliances, and provoking a man who had proven over decades that he could maintain order without chaos. Bumpy Johnson wasn't unpredictable, and that made him dangerous in a different way. Ali, meanwhile, continued his ascent. He fought, spoke out, and became larger than boxing itself. And throughout that rise, Harlem remained a place of safety rather than pressure. None of this proves a single conversation took place. None of it confirms a formal agreement. But organized crime rarely leaves signed contracts when it comes to boundaries. Instead, it leaves patterns. And the pattern here is clear. A potential conflict existed, a powerful intermediary stood in the middle, and the expected fallout never came. In true crime analysis, absence is an emptiness. Sometimes it's evidence of control working exactly as intended. From a crime analysis perspective, this situation reflects a negotiated boundary rather than an open conflict. In organized crime, power isn't always measured by who acts, but by who chooses not to. And in this case, restraint speaks louder than any public confrontation ever could. The Genovese family was one of the most powerful crime organizations in the country. Their reach extended far beyond New York, and their influence over boxing was well established. But power at that level is also strategic. It avoids unnecessary disruption. Harlem, under Bumpy Johnson's control, was profitable, stable, and predictable, three qualities organized crime values deeply. Interfering with Muhammad Ali in that environment risked upsetting a system that was already working. Bumpy Johnson, for his part, understood leverage. He didn't need to challenge the mafia head-on to assert authority. His strength came from consistency. Harlem was orderly, money flowed, violence was controlled. That made his territory valuable not just to him, but to anyone doing business in New York's criminal ecosystem. Disturbing that balance would have invited consequences far beyond a single dispute. In organized crime, restraint often signals respect. When one side steps back without forcing the issue, it usually means the cost of pushing forward is too high. That cost doesn't always involve gunfire. It can involve lost revenue, broken alliances, or attention from law enforcement, outcomes no crime family wants. This is why the absence of escalation matters. If the Genovese family truly believed they could pressure Ali without consequences, history suggests they would have tried. Instead, they didn't. That decision implies an understanding, spoken or unspoken, that Harlem was not the place to exert influence over Ali. From an analytical standpoint, this reflects a broader pattern seen throughout organized crime history. Territories are respected when leadership is strong and predictable. Outsiders test weak systems. They avoid strong ones. Bumpy Johnson had spent years proving that his control over Harlem wasn't symbolic, it was functional. It's also important to note what this restraint says about Bumpy's reputation. He wasn't known for impulsive violence. He was known for enforcing rules quietly and decisively when necessary. That made negotiations possible. When someone like Bumpy set a boundary, it carried credibility because it was backed by years of demonstrated control. Ali, whether he knew it or not, benefited from that reputation. He was shielded not by bodyguards or formal agreements, but by an ecosystem that understood limits. No one needed to threaten him directly. No one needed to announce protection. The boundary existed because everyone involved recognized the consequences of crossing it. This wasn't a clash of egos, it was a calculation. And in that calculation, restraint was the smartest move on all sides. What makes this moment significant isn't what happened, but what didn't. No violence, no scandal, no retaliation, just a quiet decision that allowed Ali to rise without interference and allowed Harlem to remain stable. In true crime analysis, these moments are easy to overlook. They leave no crime scene, no court case, no headlines, but they reveal how power actually works, not through chaos, but through control. And in this case, control was enough to keep one of the most powerful crime families in America from making a move. With the facts laid out, the story narrows into three main theories. None are proven beyond doubt, but each helps explain why this moment unfolded the way it did and why it ended without bloodshed. Theory 1. No real threat existed. The simplest explanation is that there was never a serious threat to Muhammad Ali in the first place. Under this view, rumors of mafia interests were exaggerated, misunderstood, or inflated over time. Ali was famous, yes, but not every famous boxer became a target for coercion or control. The strength of this theory lies in the lack of visible fallout. There were no arrests, no violent incidents tied to Ali in Harlem, and no public disputes involving organized crime. From a legal standpoint, there's no smoking gun. But this theory runs into a major problem. It ignores history. Boxing in the mid-20th century was deeply entangled with organized crime. Fighters of Ali's stature were rarely left alone, especially when enormous betting money was involved. The idea that the mafia simply had no interest at all doesn't fully align with established patterns. Absence of evidence, in this case, doesn't automatically mean absence of intent. Theory 2. Bumpy issued a quiet warning. This theory suggests that Bumpy Johnson stepped in early and decisively, setting a boundary before the situation escalated, not through public threats or violence, but through private channels understood within the criminal world. The strongest argument here is consistency. This approach fits Bumpy's known leadership style, measured, strategic, and disciplined. It also explains why there was no interference, no retaliation, and no escalation. Problems resolved early rarely leave records. The weakness, however, is documentation. There is no recorded meeting, no wiretap, no signed agreement. Everything rests on inference, reputation, and outcome. From a legal standpoint, it's unprovable. From a crime analysis standpoint, it's entirely plausible. Theory 3. Mutual business understanding. The third theory takes emotion out of the equation altogether. It suggests there was no warning, no confrontation, and no protection motivated by loyalty or morality. Instead, both sides recognized that interfering with Ali in Harlem simply wasn't worth the risk. Under this view, the Genovese family saw no financial advantage in pushing the issue. Harlem was stable. Ali was profitable regardless. Bumpy maintained order. Everyone benefited by doing nothing. This theory explains the silence perfectly, but it leaves a critical question unresolved. If Ali had been threatened, who would have stepped in? Was he protected or merely lucky? A business understanding doesn't guarantee safety, it only guarantees convenience. When viewed together, these theories aren't mutually exclusive. Reality may sit somewhere in between. A potential threat existed, a powerful intermediary stood in the middle, and a calculation was made that escalation wasn't worth the cost. What matters most isn't which theory is true, but what the outcome reveals. A world where violence was common chose restraint. A powerful crime family chose not to act, and a Harlem kingpin maintained influence without drawing attention. In true crime, those are rarely accidents. Sometimes the most important moments aren't marked by gunshots or court cases, but by decisions quietly made and lines that never get crossed. Even after examining the theories, some questions refuse to settle, and these are the questions that keep this story alive decades later. Who first flagged Muhammad Ali as a potential target? In the world of organized crime, interest doesn't appear out of nowhere. Someone notices the money moving, someone notices the betting spikes, someone notices influence growing too fast. It could have been bookmakers watching unusual action, it could have been intermediaries tracking promoters and payouts, or it could have been figures higher up, recognizing that Ali wasn't just a fighter, but a global force who couldn't be easily steered. Whoever raised that flag likely did so quietly, long before the public ever sensed anything was wrong. Then there's the most important mystery. What conversations happened behind closed doors? Organized crime rarely operates through public threats. It works through trusted messengers, indirect language, and mutual understanding. A single conversation between representatives, not principals, could have been enough to settle everything. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just clarity. Harlem was spoken for. Ali was off limits. Or perhaps the conversation went the other way, an acknowledgement that pushing further simply wasn't worth the risk. Either way, whatever was said worked, because no one crossed the line afterward. And then there's Muhammad Ali himself. Did he ever know how close he may have come to danger? That question may never be answered. Ali was bold, outspoken, and fearless in public, but that doesn't mean he was fully aware of every force moving around him. Protection in the criminal world is often invisible by design. The safest outcomes are the ones the protected never notice. If Bumpy Johnson did step in, it's entirely possible Ali never knew, or if he did know, he may have chosen not to speak about it, understanding that silence preserved the protection itself. What makes this especially haunting is how easily the story could have gone another way. A single miscalculation, a single misunderstanding, a single attempt to exert pressure in the wrong place, and history could look very different. Instead, what we see is absence. No threats carried out, no public disputes, no violent consequences. And in true crime analysis, absence like this often means the system worked exactly as intended. But it also means the truth remains just out of reach. No recordings, no affidavits, no first-hand confirmations, only patterns, reputations, and outcomes that suggest something significant happened without ever being documented. That's the paradox of power at this level. The stronger it is, the less visible it becomes. Ali went on to become more than a champion. He became a symbol of resistance, identity, and global influence. Harlem remained stable. Bumpy Johnson continued to rule quietly. So now the question turns to you. Do you believe Bumpy Johnson truly protected Muhammad Ali, or was this simply a calculated business understanding between powerful crime interests? Because those two ideas aren't the same. Protection implies intent. It suggests Bumpy saw Ali as someone worth safeguarding, whether out of respect, community loyalty, or recognition of what Ali represented to Harlem, a young black champion, outspoken, politically aware, and admired, someone whose presence elevated the neighborhood, not just financially, but symbolically. Under that lens, Bumpy's role looks almost paternal, not sentimental, but deliberate. Keep him safe, keep trouble away, maintain order. But there's another possibility. What if this wasn't protection at all, but surveillance? In organized crime, keeping someone safe often means keeping them within sight, knowing where they go, who they meet, who has access. A watched figure is a controlled figure, even if no pressure is applied. Under this view, Ali wasn't being guarded out of loyalty. He was being managed as a valuable asset passing through a sensitive territory. And then there's the business angle. Was this simply an agreement between crime powers to avoid unnecessary disruption? Harlem stayed profitable. Boxing money continued flowing. The Genovese family avoided conflict. Bumpy maintained autonomy. Everyone won without anyone having to step forward publicly. That version strips emotion from the story entirely. No hero, no protector, just calculation. But here's what complicates that explanation. Ali wasn't passive. He wasn't quiet. He challenged systems. He challenged power. He didn't behave like someone being managed or steered. And yet, nothing happened to him. No pressure campaigns, no financial traps, no intimidation in Harlem. That absence is hard to ignore. So ask yourself, if this were purely business, why leave Ali untouched when history shows others weren't? And if this were protection, why was it never acknowledged? In the criminal world, true influence doesn't need to announce itself. The strongest protection is the kind no one tests, the kind that works once and never has to work again. Maybe Bumpy Johnson didn't see himself as Ali's guardian. Maybe he simply saw a line that shouldn't be crossed. Or maybe he recognized that some figures carry consequences beyond profit. Was Ali being shielded, or was he being watched? Or was he something rarer, a person powerful enough to force restraint from systems that usually don't show it? That's what makes this story endure. There is no final answer, no document to point to, no confession waiting to be uncovered, just patterns, silence, and outcomes that suggest something important happened without ever leaving a trace. And that's where true crime lives, not just in what we can prove, but in what power chooses to hide. I want to know how you see it. Do you believe Bumpy Johnson stepped in to protect Muhammad Ali? Or do you think this was a quiet agreement between criminal powers to avoid unnecessary risk? Was Ali free or simply untouched? Let me know your thoughts below. Moments like this show how power really works, not through headlines, but through quiet decisions that prevent violence before it happens. If you found this breakdown insightful, like the video, share it, and subscribe for more deep dives into real crime stories where history and the underworld intersect. Thanks for watching. Stay curious.